So if you would all please welcome Guy Benson.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen. And by the way, I have to say, and I didn't tell her I was going to do this, but Mary Ellen is here in this country fighting the political battles for us and with us, and her husband is in Afghanistan fighting for our country. So just thank you so much, Mary Ellen. I know it's so tough, to be separated from your spouse for long periods of time, but apparently before Christmas he's coming home, and we're excited to see him. It's so great to be here, here in South Florida. It just reminds me of a little story. So I went to journalism school in college at Northwestern, and one of our requirements was to do essentially an internship for credit at some point during your junior year. So I did mine at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, and also for NBC 6, I believe it was, in Palm Beach, right? So I spent some time down here and got to know the area. So flash forward to last summer. I was at the Iowa State Fair. Who wasn't? But it was right in the midst of this whole presidential primary season getting underway, and so I was there for townhall.com covering the primary, and there was going to be a debate and that sort of thing. And the Democrats had deployed a surrogate to go to Iowa to make sure that the local media was getting the other side of the story. And that Democratic surrogate was none other than one of the finest public officials in South Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is the DNC chairwoman. So I have a special place in my heart for Debbie. And I've written a lot about some of the more interesting and incisive things she's had to say through the years. And so I decided that maybe it'd be an opportunity to go ask her some questions, because she was just standing there. So I was wearing a T-shirt and shorts and just walked up, and my friend had a camera sort of behind me. And I said, Congresswoman, it's so nice to meet you. My name's Guy. I used to do an internship in your district, and I was, Las Olas Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale. And she's like, oh, that's great. How wonderful. I said, why do you keep lying about Medicare? And it was like she had been shocked. She had no idea this was coming. I'm like, because you keep saying this, but Medicare's own actuaries tell the truth, which is that. So why do you keep repeating that? And also, what's your party's plan to fix Medicare if you're going to keep lying about the Republicans' plan? And all of a sudden, you see just this panicked look cross her face, and she starts tucking her hair behind her ears and blinking a lot and sort of rambling on this incoherent answer. And eventually, one of her handlers came over and quickly took her away. And he came back to me and said, who are you with? I said, well, I'm with townhall.com, but I wasn't aware that I had to be with anyone as an American citizen to ask a question of a public official in a public place. And he said, don't get wise with me. And I thought, well, in his defense, you probably get a warped sense of the word wise when you're working for Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So anyway, I just want to speak for a few minutes about what we've been talking about here today, and then would love to take some of your questions. We just got an introduction from Mary Ellen about the concept of citizen journalism. And I think it really is a modern media revolution. Back in the day, you had 3 television networks, 2 or 3 newspapers, principally the New York Times, that dominated the national discussion. And that is ancient history. You had another era that was ushered in, where there was the advent of talk radio, and then Fox News, and some sites like Drudge and others. But I think even some of those media outlets, their influence isn't waning, but they aren't the only game in town anymore when it comes to an alternative media, which I think is a good thing, by the way. I think more media, more voices, more speech, more scrutiny is a good thing. So we're kind of in a new frontier, buoyed by technology and also a growing and richly earned distrust of the ruling class and a simmering anger among Americans at the existing media for just not doing its job. And I think it's out of laziness, it's out of cluelessness, it's out of elitism, and often it is out of just rank partisanship, and in some case all of the above. So there's the iconic phrase, of course, we the people. And I think that is taking on new meaning. and being refreshed here in the 21st century. And all of you here are a part of that. And it's very exciting, but it also comes with certain responsibilities, because really, what is a citizen journalist? What does that even mean? I went, as I mentioned, to journalism school, where we were trained how to be journalists properly with the ethics and that sort of thing. And in my current position at Town Hall and in the radio world and on television, my role is to report the truth and also to offer some of the sharpest opinions that I can, while openly acknowledging my own worldview and biases, right? Which I think is a big difference from the mainstream press, which I think is what drives a lot of us crazy. People who pretend to be something that they aren't. I think it would be great if we had reporters, like so-and-so name, parentheses, D, New York, right? Because it would be helpful to know exactly whom they support and whom they vote for, and I think we know overwhelmingly what party tends to get journalists' support. So I think that if you are a citizen and a patriot and you want to affect some change, there are different roles to play. Not everyone is going to be or can be or should be the next Rush Limbaugh. I think he's inimitable. I think it's very difficult to be the next Rush Limbaugh. The most talented person on earth probably couldn't pull that off. But that sort of thing, right? Not everyone can or should be a candidate for office. But you're here to equip yourselves today with the tools to make a difference in Florida. And I'm going to echo what Mary Ellen said. Local and state matters are so important. I cannot emphasize this enough. You guys are the eyes and ears of the liberty movement here, on the ground, in one of the most important swing states in the country. And think of it this way. Where does the left groom its leaders of tomorrow? At the state and local level. These people don't just come out of nowhere. Even Barack Obama, his somewhat enigmatic and meteoric rise started on the ground as a state senator in Illinois, in Chicago. And they identify their talent at this level. And that's why it's important to make sure that you guys are paying attention now, because someone who's a state house rep from, probably not the Panhandle, but let's say somewhere in Davie or something like that, could be the next person running for U.S. Senate and perhaps U.S. Senator 10, 15 years down the road. And so I want to give you a few examples of citizen journalists, really making a difference. And one goes back, I think by now it's an example that's been beaten into the ground to some extent, but it's important. You had CBS News and 60 Minutes, which is, if you go to journalism school and you talk to journalism professors, it is the gold standard of television news reporting. This is what they believe. And they had a story that came out just before the 2004 presidential election, which said President Bush had cheated and had gotten some special treatment and was able to essentially dodge some service in the Texas Air National Guard, and they had memos that proved it. And it was commenters on conservative blogs who happened to be experts in typewriters who looked at the memos and said, you know what, BS, that's a forgery, and here's why. And this was, talk about the grassroots, this percolated up from commenters. There was a guy in Montana commenting on a conservative website, and it made its way all the way up and eventually brought down an entire story on 60 Minutes, which could have flipped the presidential election. Let's not forget, John Kerry came within a few thousand votes in Ohio of being the 44th president of the United States, but he lost. And I think this was a really seminal moment. And you had CBS absolutely doggedly defending this story to the bitter end. Dan Rather, one of the most prominent newsmen, a CBS newsman, became former newsman Dan Rather because of this story. And you had the left reduced to arguing after it was shown that the memos were fake. And even CBS was like, yeah, okay, sorry, we retract the report. Weeks later, the left was insisting, well, the memos were fake. They were fake but accurate. That was their phrase, fake but accurate, which sometimes I feel like could be a terrific new slogan for CBS News. More recently, there were the 2010 midterm elections. You guys probably remember those. Some things happened, some good things. I think you guys got some new folks here in this state. I think a new senator comes to mind. A new Congressman, Alan West, comes to mind. It was a really big year. And while we're on the theme here of citizen journalists, there was a guy named Bob Etheridge, Democrat, North Carolina, congressman. And he was approached on the street in Washington, D.C., in mid-June of 2010, a few months before the election. This was almost exactly 2 years ago. And it was two college students came up to him, and they were asking about his policy views and asking whether he supported the Obama agenda on X, Y, or Z, and they had a camera with them. Etheridge completely lost it. You might remember this video. He demanded to know who these people were, who are you with. He slapped at the camera, and he physically grabbed one of the students by his neck. He just completely lost it. The video went viral. Eventually, Etheridge offered an elaborate apology, but it was too little, too late, and 5 months later, he became former Congressman Bob Etheridge in a seat now held by Tea Party-backed Renee Elmers, who's a nurse, and she's done a really nice job. I mean, talk about night and day. That was one incident. And if you talk to people at the NRCC, which I did all the time, the Beltway establishment group in charge of winning House seats, and they do good work, the NRCC said that that seat was the one that they were least expecting to flip. But it flipped. And they point back to this random encounter with citizen journalists, college students, that was a huge flashpoint in that race. Then in Illinois, my former home state, where I lived for 7 years or so, Congressman Phil Hare, Democrat, Illinois, confronted by constituents after the Obamacare vote, and they were pressing him on why he decided and agreed to vote for Obamacare. He was asked specifically, what constitutional provision justified the passage of this law? Hare cited language in the Declaration of Independence. When someone pointed out his error, he said, that's the Declaration, not the Constitution, Congressman, he sneered, oh, that doesn't matter. He then added, quote, I don't really worry about the Constitution on this, to be honest, end quote. The clip went viral. He issued a clarification later, but it was too little too late, and 7 months later, he was former Congressman Phil Hare in a seat now held by Tea Party-backed local pizza parlor owner, and father of 10, Bobby Schilling. These things make a difference. Finally, how many of you are familiar with the work of my colleague at Town Hall, Katie Pavlich, and what she's done on the Fast and Furious scandal? Only a few hands. She has a book called Fast and Furious, and it is literally the book on the scandal. She is from Arizona. And I think, a lot of people now know about Fast and Furious, and it's a hot topic, and everyone is talking about it. But how did it begin? It began with ATF whistleblowers on the ground in the state of Arizona leaking to local bloggers. And it's made its way up the chain to the point that a couple weeks ago, the House of Representatives held the sitting Attorney General of the United States in contempt of Congress. I mean, that is a major series of events, and you now have polls showing the majority of the American people believe that the Obama administration, which now, by the way, of course, the president has exerted executive privilege here to a little CYA action here, and you can ask me about that acronym later when I'm off mic, but they are stonewalling. They are stonewalling an investigation dealing with the murders of hundreds of people, including at least one, probably two, U.S. agents. They are stonewalling that. And I think it's fascinating. They're talking about we need more gun control after the tragedy and the horrible act in Colorado. And these are the people who gave automatic weapons to drug cartels. It's just amazing. And they don't want the light shining in their face because they know that there's stuff lurking there. And this was because of citizen journalists, local bloggers, people staying on. Look, I give Katie, my colleague, so much credit. She was on this story from day one and kept pressing. And there were days where I'm like, you are just obsessed with this thing. And she was right to be obsessed with it. She is not giving me any sort of commission. I urge you to buy her book because it's called Fast and Furious, Katie Pavlich. It's so important. And that story is far from over. And I think it's interesting because a few weeks ago, I was watching Hannity, and Juan Williams was up against Michelle Malkin, and they were debating some of these things. And look, I know both of them. Michelle is just a bulldog, a beautiful bulldog, right? She is amazing. And Juan, I think, really is a terrific guy. I disagree with him on a lot of things, but he's an intellectually honest person, by and large. But occasionally I think he gets it wrong. And so they were talking about Fast and Furious. They were talking about these national security leaks. And Juan sort of snippily was dismissing Michelle Malkin and people like her as, quote, just bloggers. You're not real journalists like I am. And I think that just goes to show that 8 years after Rathergate in 2004 and the fake memos, they still do not get it. And by the way, I do want to say, in defense of CBS, since I've been ripping them a little bit, Cheryl Atkinson is one of their investigative reporters. She has been just as tenacious as Katie on Fast and Furious, and she has gotten cursed out twice by the White House for just telling the truth. And I think if there's anyone who deserves a Pulitzer, it's Cheryl Atkinson. So there are people who are doing their jobs. We just need to supplement them because there's not nearly enough. Citizen journalists make an enormous impact. And the left cannot wish that fact away. That's why training sessions like this today are so important. The left has been honing its organizational and activism skills to perfection for years. They have turnkey foot soldiers, a lot of whom are union members and government union members, and they can just summon them whenever they are needed. And I understand at least earlier we had a few of them with us in the back of the room, although it appears that they've left, which is interesting. They were here maybe to try to trip up Hannah, and then took off, which is perfect because now I'm going to tell you all the secret stuff. But the point is they were organized enough to have multiple volunteers in the back of this meeting today. They are focused and they are determined, and they have gotten really, really good at this. And I think that's why groups like True the Vote and the Franklin Center and Americans for Prosperity, this is why they loathe those groups, because they see their tactics being adopted by us, by the wrong side, and it infuriates them. That's why they want to intimidate and drag down and pull down these groups, and that's why it's so important that you guys are here to stand up and say, no, thank you, we're here, we're not going anywhere. So I don't have to tell you, I feel like in some ways preaching to the choir, you're here on a Saturday. All day on a beautiful Saturday inside a windowless room talking about politics and activism for like 8 hours. Because people say, oh gosh, I'm worried for the country, what can I do? Well, you can do what you're doing now. And the tools that you get here, don't just let this be a feel-good moment today. Go out and employ this stuff and practice it. I hate to put it this bluntly, but let me be as clear as I possibly can. I've been following this election from the very beginning. I've been following the candidates. I've been watching the polls. It's my job. If Mitt Romney does not win the state of Florida in November, he will not win, and we will have an 8-year presidency of Barack Obama, period. The math does not work unless Mitt Romney wins this state. Now, there's other pieces that would have to fall into place, and it's not just, but if he loses Florida, the election is lost, period. No pressure. Actually, pressure. Yes, pressure. We got to win this thing, and you guys are the boots on the ground. You can and you must make a difference. So I just want to make a few final points, and I'd be happy to take questions about anything, the election or anything else you have on your mind. But to tie back into some of what we heard last night and earlier on about True the Vote and voter integrity, I was on a panel at this conference. I go to a conference the last couple of years in Boulder, Colorado, hosted by the University of Colorado. It's called the Conference on World Affairs, and it's great. I mean, it is incredible. They have dozens and dozens of panels, tens of thousands of people over the course of a week attend these panels. It's free and open to the public. It is a very, very left-wing place. And of, I believe, 95 participants, about 5 of us are conservatives. And so I was one of the tokens, and I was on a panel of 4 people talking about voter ID. And it was 2 guys from The Nation and 1 guy from Mother Jones and me. And there were a few points that I brought up in this discussion that I think are so important for you guys to have, because especially if you're involved with True the Vote, you're going to have the racism stuff thrown in your face. And I think John mentioned a few of these things last night, but I want to reinforce them, because these are, you need to unfortunately, it's not just pundits who need to have talking points. You need to have talking points because you're going to get challenged. People might come up to you with a camera and a microphone. Your neighbors and friends might ask you these questions. Eric Holder at the NAACP, 2 weeks ago, talked about voter ID laws. He called them voter suppression laws. And he said, we call these poll taxes. And he got a big cheer for that. That's fine if he wants to call them that. The problem for Eric Holder is that the Supreme Court of the United States does not call them poll taxes. In fact, they have ruled on this in 2008. It was a 6-3 decision upholding Indiana's voter ID law. You know who wrote the decision? John Paul Stevens, an arch liberal, wrote the decision upholding a tough voter ID law in the state of Indiana. So it was 6-3 with Justice Stevens writing the majority opinion. And by the way, that was in the state of Indiana. That decision came down in April or May of 2008. You know what happened a few months later? Barack Obama won the state of Indiana, the first Democrat to do so in a presidential election since 1964. And he did so with the help, largely, of a huge African-American turnout in Gary, and that area just west of Chicago, or just east, of Chicago. So you had a law, it was put into place, challenged, upheld by a 6-3 majority, and a Democrat, and the first African-American ever to win the presidency, flipped that state, Indiana, for the moment, and it's going to go back, from red to blue. So it doesn't make sense, their argument that this is about racism. It does not make sense, even if you bring out the constitutionality and what happened immediately in the aftermath with that law in place. Then there was the example of Georgia, which John did bring up last night. Georgia passed a voter ID law during the Bush years, and it made its way through the courts. It was upheld. Liberals, of course, were suing left and right. They lost. In 2008, in the state of Georgia, the deep, dirty, ugly, racist South in the mind of these people, right? If there's going to be voter suppression anywhere, it's going to be a place like Georgia. In 2008, with the voter ID law on the books and being enforced, it was the highest turnout of minority voters in the history of the state, both African Americans and Hispanics in 2008. And you might say, well, Guy, that's unfair. Barack Obama was on the ballot. There was maybe a little bit more motivation and all of the different elements at play. Okay, fine. Let's talk about 2010. Highest turnout ever among minorities in 2010 when Barack Obama was not on the ballot. This is in Georgia with a voter ID law. The racial argument, the racist argument, the voter suppression argument is garbage. It makes no sense. It is empirically false. They have no evidence. And as John said, that is why they throw these tantrums. And finally, this drives me crazy. The left is very good at this. The left is able to make their position seem like, of course, everyone agrees with us, and you little tiny sliver of Americans, you racists, you people who are trying to disenfranchise voters, you're really going against the tide here, and, justice, or what is it, history arcs towards justice, or whatever, all their phrases that they use. This is an overwhelming issue on our side. If you look at poll after poll, this is somewhere between a 2/3 to a 3/4 issue. 70-75% of the public agrees with voter ID laws because it's common sense. And I mentioned that panel I was on at the conference in Colorado. And, they were all every single myth that you've heard was repeated. There is no such thing as voter fraud. It's a figment of the right's imagination. They're doing this to try to suppress votes, on and on. And it was a very hard left panel and a very hard left audience. But there was a middle school class that was there in attendance at that panel on a field trip. And afterwards, one of the teachers came up to me and said, Guy, would you mind meeting with the students and just answering a few questions from and these are like 11, 12-year-old kids. I said, of course. So these are kids in public school in Boulder, Colorado, one of the most liberal communities in the country. And they started peppering me with questions, 11-year-olds, saying, so why were those other people arguing against having to show an ID to vote? That doesn't have to happen? I said, in a lot of places, no, it doesn't. They're like, but you have to get on a plane, you have to show an ID. And I said, yes. And they said, and to drive, you have to show an ID. And I said, yes. They said, and if you're 21, if you want to buy alcohol, you need to have an ID. I said, yes. And they said, we don't understand. If one kid said, if there's an issue, if people can't get the IDs, why don't they just work on getting the IDs? Like, shouldn't everyone have to show who they are just to do this? You have to show an ID everywhere else. And it's, one of those from the mouths of babes. You have a group of 11-year-olds get it. And they sat through this stacked panel for an hour where it was me against 3 plus the moderator and all the people who asked questions. And they walked out of there as 11-year-olds and said, no, that was all a bunch of baloney. Because that's how much I think this plays into common sense. And we've got the public on our side, we've got the law on our side, we've got the truth on our side. And we cannot let ourselves get intimidated, because that's what they're trying to do, to make us seem like we're this sort of embattled minority. We are not even close. And I think the anecdote about the middle schoolers really sort of illustrates that. So anyway, thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to come down here and talk to activists, especially in a state like this, because as I said, must win. And you guys are, as I said, the eyes and ears and the boots on the ground, and it's going to be people in this room and folks like you, and I hope you go and spread the word about these organizations and spread the word about these trainings and get involved and get out the vote, because I think this is very much a winnable state, but not if we rest on our laurels, because the left never does. I feel like they never sleep. They're constantly figuring out how to ruin the country more, and they're good at it. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks for having me. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
The speech with Holder,
Yeah.
I understood that you needed 2 IDs to get into that.
Right. If you were a member of the press and you wanted to go listen, there was so much irony about that particular speech. If you were a member of the press, you needed 2 separate forms of ID to get in to cover the speech, where Eric Holder was decrying voter ID as racist in a state that he is suing for passing voter ID. And sort of the irony is just completely lost on them. I think that there is a profound lack of self-awareness on the left. But the thing is, the cognitive dissonance, it doesn't bother them, right? It's sort of like, and it's hard to debate people like that when they can just be so incredibly hypocritical and either not realize it or just not care. But you're right. I mean, it's a hilarious irony. And I think if you point that sort of thing out, it just bolsters the majority opinion that we have. I mean, this is a 75% issue. I mean, I welcome them to keep fighting this and say, wait, you're filing a lawsuit. Why? Because you want just people to just show up and be allowed to vote regardless of who they are with no proof? Most people, even Democrats, are going to look at that and say, no, that's crazy. But, this is what they're committed to. It's almost as if they're trying to cheat. Yes. Oh, well then, yeah, well, that's tough luck. And I think you're going to hear later on from Javier, from the Shark Tank. He's going to give a presentation, I think just in a little bit, about how you need to do exactly the opposite. If you have an elected official openly telling you that he doesn't want you to pay attention to what he's doing, I think that is an open invitation to look really hard at what he's doing. And yeah, well, they're always up for election. And so they don't want you necessarily knowing who's donating to them, what they're voting about, what they're voting on, how they're voting, why. These are things, look, corruption, secrecy, and the shadows are breeding grounds for corruption. And that's why if the media isn't going to or can't shine the light, that's why citizen journalists have to exist. Because there is this giant gap that needs to be filled that Franklin and others are trying to fill with your help. Which one is it? I don't have it off the top of my head. You can. I'm sure you can Google it and ask Javier. He will know it backwards and forwards when he speaks. Yes, in the yellow shirt and then right in front.
Talking about investigative reporting and doing stuff here at the state of Florida, how many of you know that they're going to be putting tolls on I-4, the Alexis lanes that they are hitting them? Now, I'm going to go back to Orlando. I just found this out yesterday. I have confirmed via the Florida Constitution it is illegal. They're going to privatize those lanes and sell them off to a foreign group. It is unconstitutional by the Florida Constitution for them to get into any kind of partnership with any private entity. It's Article 7, Section 10, if you want to go look. And I'm going to report this to Fox 35 in Orlando and some of the others. And we're going to see if any of them will report it. It's unconstitutional. Does that matter? And also, make sure people know John Micah cannot afford 2 more years of that rhino because he's the one who pushed this stuff for his Sunrail scam rail deal. So, you know, we've got the facts. Let's see if we can get anybody in the mainstream media to report it and stop the corruption.
Yes, ma'am.
A couple of years ago, the state legislature did pass a law that they can lease out roads. We fought that, but of course they did pass it. And as for Packard, he has the lowest rating by Associated Industries in the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives. But my question for you, Guy, is when you're out interviewing, do you detect many people that are actually actors that are put out there to...
Actors?
Actors, yeah. They're not just people off the street with an opinion, but they're actual actors.
Well, it's funny that the left is good at pretending. It's funny. They accuse us of this term astroturfing, right? Nancy Pelosi famously said the healthcare protests were astroturf with swastikas. She added that for good measure. When in fact they are the masters of astroturf, which means making it look like authentic grassroots when in fact these are hardened activists. They do this constantly. And what you got to do is call them out. And actually, my favorite example of this was in 2010. Do you guys know, have you heard of the governor of New Mexico, Susana Martinez? She's awesome. She is so great. And by the way, she has a 70% approval rating in New Mexico as a conservative, female, Hispanic governor in a blue state. They are, wait for the knives to come out for her. Think, you know, because they come after who they're scared of, and they should be scared of her because she's awesome. But when she was running for governor, her Democratic opponent put out an ad during the campaign, which was one of these man-on-the-street ad things. And they were going up to people and saying, oh, I just don't trust that Susana Martinez. And there was one woman who was very emphatic about how she just didn't trust her leadership. So Martinez in her campaign put out, I think, the single best ad I saw in all of 2010. It started with Susana Martinez just looking at the camera with a TV monitor. She said, hey, have you seen this ad? And they played the clip of that woman saying, I don't trust Susana Martinez. She said, that's an interesting woman on the street. What the ad didn't tell you is that when I was a prosecutor in this state, I put her husband in prison for kidnapping. And they put up a mugshot. And she just looked at the camera and shrugged. She said, sometimes ads aren't what they seem. I'm Susana Martinez, and I approve this message. And it showed that she was tough on crime and also not going to back down, and totally expose them. This was essentially an actor with an axe to grind because her husband's in prison because of Susana Martinez, and the Democrats put her up as just an average voter in an ad, and she got called out on it and just got slammed for it. And I think that's an example of a campaign doing it, but that's what we all need to be on the lookout for. Don't take anything for granted. Don't just assume what the left is putting up. Don't just assume that what they're telling you as the backstory is true. Because I think it goes back to what the other gentleman said. They would probably prefer that you not look into it, to be honest, and there's a reason for that. Any other questions? Yes?
I'm just curious about, you were talking about they call it gotcha journalism, whatever. Why is there been an opportunity where someone challenges the president in front of the camera? Why aren't you revealing to colleagues or something like that? And there's so many people in this country, and I'm just curious why.
Well, I think it is hard to corner a president. with a camera, generally, and for good reason, for security reasons and that sort of thing. But look, occasionally things just sort of happen. The president has this interesting penchant, doesn't he, for when he wanders off the script to say things that turned out to be kind of problematic for him. For example, when he approached Joe the plumber in 2008, he approached him on his lawn, and he asked him about the higher taxes, and the president, then the candidate, said, when you spread the wealth around, it's good for everyone. And what did the left do? They retaliated by looking into the private records of Joe the plumber to try to tear him down when he just asked a question. You had the president in Roanoke, Virginia, 3 weeks ago, just right down the road from where I live, off the script, talking about small businesses and how successful people should really pay more taxes because, frankly, they owe all of us. They owe the government because they didn't really build that success on their own. And there were so many problems with what he said, and the full context, in my view, is worse than the one snip that they say is out of context, which it isn't. You didn't build that, and now they are just frantic, pushing back, trying to claim that he didn't say what he actually said. And then he was in California at a fundraiser, and he was talking about his economic plan, and he said, quote, "It worked." That certainly wasn't in the script, and you had the left, interestingly, insisting furiously that that is taken out of context. And we can debate about the context, and I don't think it is out of context, but I think it's interesting that when faced with the question, are you going to defend what he said it worked, they're saying that's out of context, which is sort of a tacit admission that it didn't work, right? They're not defending the record. They're saying, how dare you quote him out of context claiming that his plans have worked? So I think that, think about that. I think it's very revealing. So he, especially in the final 3.5 months of this campaign stretch, I think his handlers are going to keep him away from average people with cameras as much as possible, because it doesn't end well for him when he's talking about what he really believes from his heart. Because what he really believes in his heart is not what a majority of the people in this country are interested in voting for, quite frankly, which is why they have to poll test everything that they say. Every speech that he gives is poll tested language to make sure that he is fooling people into thinking that he is something that he actually is not. And that's not a big, giant conspiracy theory. I just think he's much harder left than the American people and a lot of his supporters realize, and they are working all the time to keep that in place. And so that's sort of a long answer to a short question. Sir?
Yes. If you could comment, as part of this content revolution that you're speaking of, we have citizen journalists. You also have the content itself with various ascendancies of different types of content. What I've been noticing is the ascendancy of comment sections and the importance of comment sections. Recently, there was a broker who tried to commit suicide after blowing through hundreds of millions of dollars in Cedar Falls, Iowa. At 2:30 in the morning on the Wall Street Journal, after the stories, you look at the comment section, someone has posted that he's a Republican. I thought, it's up at 2:30 in the morning, and read this and then post this. And then we started to do a little research on this guy. Wow, he supported Wilson in Illinois. I don't know what he is, but there are things that might say he's not that. My point, though, is that the comment sections are actually becoming more important as influencers of the electorate than the actual news story is. Maybe you could talk a bit about it.
Yeah, I think
that how it's being used by the other side.
Well, they coming back to AstroTurf, they have people whose job it is to comment on news stories. And Media Matters is one of these Soros-funded groups that does this sort of thing. And look, comment sections can be just the absolute worst fever swamps ever. I mean, it's just anonymous people posting horrible things. But if that's where you want to engage there. It's not just comment sections. It's Facebook and Twitter are just so incredibly important, where I think the right has gotten very good, especially on Twitter, where they can turn something that the president tries to do and just throw it right back in his face so fast it becomes an embarrassment. There's been a few examples of this that have happened in recent memory. Gosh, I'm trying to. One of them was, I think they tried to start a hashtag I like Obamacare, and it was supposed to be people expressing their support for Obamacare and why. And it got totally hijacked by conservatives with just really sarcastic, funny, little quips on Twitter, and it eventually became a big embarrassment for the White House, and it was trending worldwide, but for the reasons that the White House didn't want. And so I think that sort of trench-level warfare is important because, you know, your friends on Facebook or people who follow you on Twitter, it happens so fast. You can literally help shape a narrative as it's shaping. I think that the media through the years has been very good at deciding what the narrative is going to be, right? It's not a big thing where they get in a secret meeting and say, all right, guys, here's how we're going to report the story. It's just sort of understood that these people generally come from a similar point of view in the media. So it just happens almost by osmosis. And I don't even think a lot of the times it's conscious that they're consciously doing it. But those days are fading because as narratives begin to develop, they can be changed very rapidly on Twitter. And the other thing about Twitter that's so important is a lot of the big media players are on Twitter. And so, and they read their feed. Trust me, every single person in Washington has a big enough ego that they have an entire column on their Twitter page of what people are saying about them or saying to them. So you can tweet at, you know, huge, big names, both in the party establishment, but also in the media establishment, and challenge them on things. And they notice what's happening. And I think that's a tool that is relatively new in the last couple of years that is huge, hugely important, because you can kill a story on Twitter before it even really makes it to the evening news. If something, like a perfect example was, where was Romney? He was in Pennsylvania. And NBC News, MSNBC, and Andrea Mitchell's show edited the video of a speech he gave to make it seem like he was out of touch. Remember this thing? Because he was talking about at a Wawa, and he was going to order a sandwich, and it was a touchscreen thing. He's like, it was amazing. And people were saying, oh, this is his George H.W. Bush scanner, grocery store scanner moment. And by the way, that story was also false. Do you know that? The George H.W. Bush scanner story was just not true. That never happened, but it became the narrative. And so people still reference it today. And there was just a person on Twitter, Super Mexican, I think he calls himself, who went and scoured the internet, found just a random person who had uploaded a video from within the crowd of the whole speech, and it turned out that the point Romney was making was completely disguised and cut out by MSNBC, and just put out the full video and said, here's what he was actually talking about, and it was a huge embarrassment, and the thing didn't catch on, and Andrea Mitchell gave a barely apology the next day, but the story died. The story died because of Twitter and because of a random person. And that's awesome. That's really exciting. That is something that could not have happened 10 years ago, period.
Our friends at MoveOn.org, right after Governor Scott did saying we're taking the extra Medicaid money, which is perfectly legal according to the Supreme Court. A lawyer sent this out. We got it at work. Oh, Governor Scott obeyed the law. Who gives the extra money?
Yeah, that's not the law. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the Supreme Court decision on Obamacare, it was 7-2 on the Medicaid part, so it wasn't even close. Nice try, though. Correct him and say nice try. One more. I think we have time for one more, if there is one. If not, no. Thank you guys so much. You're great. Thanks for being here.